Hi everybody, just getting the orientation on the phone right here. Hi everybody, just getting the orientation on the phone right here. Okay, can somebody tell me if you can see me or hear me? Okay, can somebody tell me if you can see me? There we go. I see there's a couple folks here already. Hi Paul, hi David. If you can hear me, can one of you type that? Yes, okay, perfect. Great. Well, yes, let's go ahead and get started. It's good to see all of you, and hope that this is a memorable and useful chat for everybody. It's a little bit different from the chats that I've done before that are sort of more freewheeling in terms of their subject matter. This one came about specifically as a result of a blog that I wrote, and looking back at the blog, which I did earlier today, I see that I wrote it back in 2011, so it's been quite a few years. I wanted to reread it for a couple of reasons. One of which is just to see if I still believe and agree with the things that I wrote all those years ago, and I'm happy to say that I do, and I have some additional thoughts as well that I can share as we go along. The blog in question was called Myth Through Years of Coaching People to Get Ready for Auditions. The blog is still available on CelloChat. I don't know if it's possible for us to put a link up to the blog there. It's not necessary to have read it before this chat, but just want to make sure it's available to as many people as possible afterwards who are interested in reading it. So I thought maybe the easiest way to structure this chat was for me to sort of go on to go through the myths. I counted there are 9 of them that I have on the list, and spend the first part of the hour doing that and sort of explaining the idea behind them and expanding a little bit on those concepts, and then going back and seeing what questions have come up, because I do want to make sure we get through the whole blog. So maybe it's the most efficient way to do it. So if this comes across a little bit like a rant, I apologize in advance, but this is a subject that I feel quite strongly about. I do have my cello here, although obviously I'm not sure how much playing I'll do. We do sing with our instruments, and we speak with them and chant with them. I don't know if we actually rant with our instruments, but certainly we do that with our with our mouths. So part of the reason I feel this way is because I feel like one of the worst tragedies that I come across as a coach of people who are getting ready for auditions is when somebody plays and they seem like they aren't really comfortable with what they're doing. And when I pick a little bit below the surface about why certain decisions were made, the person says something to the effect of, well, there was this person a couple years ago that told me that if I started this phrase with a down bow that I would never get a job. And obviously that is completely ridiculous on the face of it, but you'd be surprised at how much of that advice gets given, and some of it gets given in a good spirit, but then maybe is interpreted by the player in quite a rigid way, or a way that takes the player away from in their comfort zone when they actually go to perform. And we all know that nobody likes to be outside their comfort zone in a performance. It's much better to be in it. So I feel like it's a mission for me and for those like me to help as many people as we can proactively, but also by lifting weights off of their shoulders that they might be carrying in the form of preconceived notions or advice that's not so useful. So that is why this blog was written. I see that in my introduction, I say that since audition preparation can be heavily influenced by certain common assumptions, paying attention to the myths might help audition takers avoid being sidetracked by them. And it is true that what others say can be very powerful, depending on who's saying it and who's listening. This is the sort of the spirit in which these suggestions were made. So with that, let's go down the list here and identify some of these myths, and we'll get to your questions, as many of them as we can, later in the hour. So the first one, and I put this first on purpose, and I remember putting it first and thinking, yes, this is the first one. And it's that boring, perfect playing is what will win an audition. Obviously, it's not necessarily true that any certain type of playing will win anything. And further, it sort of gets us down the road of thinking that there are various types of playing, and we need to do this type of playing when we do auditions, and this type when we play concerti or chamber music or what have you. And if we think about great playing, I think you'll agree that there are obviously infinite ways to play beautifully, but if we think about the common qualities that all great playing has, that we know, there's actually a lot more sameness to it with the basic principles that are underneath it than there are differences. And so I prefer to help people connect the idea that playing in an orchestra, taking an audition, playing a recital, playing a string quartet, that it's not 5 types of playing. It's just all good musicianship expressed through the cello. That on a basic level will give us success in all of these musical endeavors that seem like they're sort of in separate silos, but in reality, I don't really think that they are. Is that in an audition, there are enough unknowns already. If we play a recital, you probably know what hall you're going to play in. You can have a dress rehearsal there. You probably know many of the people who are going to come and listen. At an audition, you know none of those things. And that's okay. You don't know what the hall will sound like. You don't know how many people will be listening or who they are. Control what you can control and leave the rest. Remember again that beautiful playing sounds like beautiful playing everywhere you go. Doesn't matter whether the hall is dry or reverberant. It doesn't matter how many people are listening. It doesn't matter where the screen is. If you have a wonderful relationship with the music and with expressing it through your cello, then that is going to carry to any committee anywhere. So much, much more productive to focus on that, which is the thing that we can very much control, and leave the sound of the hall, leave the other stuff completely behind. For it's much more important to develop a musical understanding of each work which is independent from any particular recorded interpretation, even a great recording. Chicago Symphony, collected sort of through my adolescence of collecting recordings. And so I prepared for the audition. Maybe I listened to a recording or two by this orchestra as part of my process, but definitely not for every piece that I was going to be playing. I had never heard the orchestra live in a concert before my audition. I had never been inside of Orchestra Hall before my audition. And in fact, the first time I ever laid eyes on the inside of Orchestra Hall was when the stage door opened and I saw the hall, and I sort of went like this with my eyes, and there was walked the carpet out to the solitary chair out there for my audition. So I didn't know how the hall was going to sound, and Haydn D major was the first thing that I chose to play, and so a couple notes in, I had an idea of what the hall sounded like and what my sound sounded like in that hall, and that was that. So it was not necessary for me to know the entire recorded legacy of the orchestra, and I guess I like to say that in general, recordings can be used for good or for evil. And we all know as instrumentalists, we deal with this when we're learning whatever repertoire. Bach suites come to mind as something that's particularly fraught, because of course we want to know what other people do, but we don't want to know so much about what other people do that it starts to sort of infiltrate our own process. So a recording can be used for good when it's used to add to our sort of inner library of musicianship, to get to know pieces, to get to know repertoire. But recordings can also be used in a much more surfacey way, which is to sort of clock tempi, or to try to figure out, I don't know, what bowings people are doing, or what the style is of the ensemble. If there's an official Chicago Symphony Orchestra tempo for anything, I don't know what it is. If you know, write it in the comments. In the case of this orchestra that I play in too, some of our best known recordings are from the 1950s. And guess what? All those people are dead. Actually, almost all of those people are dead. But those are the people who played that tempo at that time. And so the idea that you would put that on as a way of figuring out what the right tempo is that you should play Beethoven 5 in your solo audition for this orchestra, I hope I'm succeeding in getting across how ridiculous that is. So again, my last sort of sentence to sum up the discussion of this comment says, satisfy yourself with your playing. Certainly that should come before emulating any particular aspect of any particular recording of a piece. So very important point there, because I know, particularly in wind and brass playing, there are collective styles that sort of, string playing as well, but different orchestras have different collective personalities that they become known for. But that's one thing, to play concerts on stage and to sort of have a DNA that goes down through the generations. That's a wonderful thing, and it's certainly true in the Chicago Symphony as well, but it does not mean that you need to get to know the recorded legacy of the group in order to have audition success. Okay? Number 4, this is a good one. If you make an error right off the bat at your audition, you might as well give up because the committee has lost interest. This is important to say. I'm not going to deny that let's say the first 2 minutes of somebody's audition go a long way toward setting the tone of what the committee thinks of you. So you don't have a lot of time to make a good impression, but you do have plenty of time beyond a particular note that's not quite in tune, or a particular moment of bad sound, or a particular moment of nervousness, whatever it is that comes up at the very beginning of an audition. You definitely have the possibility to rewrite that. And if we think about listening to a recital, which we've all done, if it's beautiful playing, don't we forgive the little things that seem like flukes in the context of a recital that's played at a very high level? Of course we do. General tendencies in somebody's playing, on the contrary, sound like general tendencies. So if you play very well in tune, except for 1% of the time, the impression of the committee is that you play very well in tune, or sound quality, or whatever, any of the other basics that you have to show at an audition. So, the psychological aspect for the player is a whole other ball game, which is if you're playing any performance and something goes a little wrong right off the bat, it can probably be a bit more difficult to get past that and just continue. But that is what we have to do, and it helps to remember how those little blips are received by the audience. And in that sense, we're all experts in that, because we've all listened to live concerts, and we've heard little things that go wrong because, hey, it's live music. And we forgive and forget the majority of that stuff if the rest of the playing is gripping and beautiful and wonderful. So, yes, this when I mentioned Haydn D earlier, it's reminding me a little bit of a joke that I forget who told me this, but sometimes Haydn D is required to play at an audition for cello, and it is required here in Chicago. Sometimes it's not required, but somebody told me once that playing Haydn D, choosing to play Haydn D for an audition, is like wearing a white suit to an Italian restaurant. Now, I don't know if I know why it's a joke. I don't know if I necessarily agree, but in the case of my audition here, I didn't have a choice anyway, so I had to play it and just make the best of it. Good. That's number 4. Myth number 5. This is sort of an easier one to deal with quickly. It says, if you didn't play for very long, head straight for the airport pub because you didn't advance. And the corollary to that is, if you play longer or play more excerpts during your audition than others, it means that the committee liked you better. Basically, with regard to this, I would say, forget it. Forget it all. Like all of it. Any assumptions about how much you play, how little you play, they don't necessarily mean anything innately positive or negative. Every orchestra structures their auditions slightly differently, and there's sometimes more or less leeway to do different things with different players. Sometimes everybody plays exactly the same thing for an entire day of auditions. Sometimes not. But certainly I've heard it said that, if you're backstage and you hear the person before you playing the Tannhauser excerpt, which I'm referencing because David Sanders is listening, and he loves that one. And then at the end of your audition, you didn't get that far and you didn't play Tannhauser. You assume, it's like, oh, I'm heading for the airport because there's no way I advanced. And it's not necessarily true. And I say in the blog that there have been a couple of examples of people who were so sure that they did not advance that they left the building and ended up being called back because the committee wanted to hear them again. So certainly you can save yourself that trouble, but I would say also save yourself the mental baggage that goes along with this. The proactive way to give advice about this is be ready for anything. Be ready for any amount of playing, any excerpt in any order, and maybe even the possibility of repeating an excerpt or two twice, maybe 3 times. Who knows? But in your preparation, it's so helpful to approach things with that attitude and to walk into, as we say, a situation where there are many unknowns, just to say, well, what I know is that whatever order they ask me to play these things in, or however much I'm going to play, it doesn't matter to me because I've got something to say with this music. Yes? Good. Next one. This is also maybe a little bit self-explanatory, but at the time I felt like it was worth putting on this list. And it's, if you don't have access to a great old Italian cello to use for an audition, it's difficult to compete with someone who does. I honestly don't know how much this happens these days, partially because there are so many wonderful modern makers of instruments out there, and also because expensive old Italian cellos cost like $1 trillion now, so you know we don't always have access to them if we want. But if for you or somebody you know, the idea comes up of, I don't know about my instrument, I feel like it might be limiting me, I should see if I could borrow something better, or a bow for that matter, to borrow a better bow. I wouldn't say don't consider it, but most of the time I think it's not really necessary, and it's useful to remember that people always sound their best on the thing that they are most comfortable with. So if that's, that's liable to be your own instrument with whatever its strengths and weaknesses are. Sometimes when we're listening to auditions back to back, we'll hear somebody who plays with a cello that tends toward the brighter side of the spectrum, and they'll be followed by somebody who plays with quite a darker, more muted sound instrument. And that's okay. Certainly don't worry about the instruments of the people who are playing around you in comparison to yours, because the committee's ears adjust very quickly to that. And as I said before, from the first few notes that somebody's playing, we are paying very close attention, not so much to the innate sound of your instrument, but to what the person is doing with it. So if this is an issue at all anymore these days, please know that it does not have to be. All right, number 7. Oh, this is a good one too. It says you should try to think about what the committee wants to hear and adjust your playing accordingly. So there are different ways to think about this. Let's sort of piggyback on something that came up just a minute ago, which is that we have something to say with the music, right? Yo-Yo sometimes talks in master classes about the difference between performing as though we have something to prove and something to say. And obviously, or it should be obvious that making music with the idea that you have something to prove, whether it's to prove something to yourself or prove something to your audience or to a committee or even to the composer, it's just not the best frame of mind to be free to connect with the music and connect that music with whoever's listening. So it's not that it's a bad question to ask, which is what would an audience like to hear, but the better question is, what do I have to say with this music? And I say in my answer to the blog, I include a sentence there that basically is a response to a question somebody asked me once, which is, can you sum up in one sentence what an orchestra committee wants to hear from players? And at first I was a bit taken aback by having to do that, and then I put some thought into it, and I realized, yes, I can sum it up in one sentence, and it's right here in the paragraph after number 7. What we want to hear is someone with valid, sophisticated musical ideas and the technical means to express them. Nothing more. So what does that mean? What does valid mean? Well, valid, to me, when I wrote the sentence, means that it comes from a genuine place of connection to the music and to the composer, which means also that you're generally within the established norms of style for that composer. You know, how are Schubert and Shostakovich different? It's easier to play it than it is to talk about it. So anyway, valid ideas. What does sophisticated mean? Well, sophisticated to me means that you're not just stopping with what's on the printed page, and the person's thinking actually goes a number of levels below that. So valid and sophisticated musical ideas and the technical means to express them, which only means that the person has control over the cello in order to be able to say what they want to say. So if you want to aim for what the committee wants to hear, this is the thing to aim for. So it's not necessarily to think about what does this person want or what does this orchestra want, or, you know, so you can sort of see that there's two ways to interpret this. In a general sense, there is playing that will galvanize practically any committee, which is what makes us want to give somebody a job. I don't listen the same way as my colleagues do necessarily, and in Chicago anyway, we don't discuss players before we vote. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the type of player who's liable to advance to the next round and the type of player who's liable to be in the finals and actually be hired for the job is somebody who's not trying to please all the individuals on the committee, but is rather laying down something that is so interesting and musically communicative, and that they play the cello well enough to be able to do that. That's basically the type of playing that gets that result. What else can I say about that? It comes back to the general idea I mentioned earlier that with good playing, there's far more about it that is the same as any other thing we do. Recital, concerto, far more that's the same than there is that's different. So resist the temptation to think, again, in an audition, that it's all about pleasing the committee. The committee will be pleased by certain things, but that's a different way to look at it and a more productive way to look at it. Good. Moving on, we just got 2 more. I also like number 8 here, which says that the best coach for your cello excerpts is a cellist. And I say right away that this is not so much a myth, because obviously cellists can give wonderful advice to other cellists, but it's an incomplete assumption, because it implies that only somebody who knows what's difficult on the cello is going to be able to take apart your playing and address the little intricacies of what's going to make things, better. And I would say, on the contrary, somebody who doesn't know what's difficult on the cello is just as well poised to be able to tell us what's good or what seems odd in the sound. If you imagine, this is usually true on a committee anyway. If you're a cellist who's auditioning, most of the committee is going to be made up of cello players, but there's probably going to be a couple of violinists or violists, maybe a clarinet player, maybe a percussionist or a trumpet player. And the clarinetist won't know necessarily what's difficult on the cello, but clarinetists know what legato is. And clarinetists know what constitutes a beautiful phrase or a wide dynamic range, for example. They know, other good musicians recognize good playing. It's just a question of what instrument the person happens to be playing. So I say this in my answer here, aiming to please the ear of someone who doesn't know the challenges unique to our instrument is something that we should all do. Because the advice that you can get that way is sometimes it's often good advice, and sometimes it's actually revelatory advice, especially if we speak about singers and pianists who have a much broader repertoire than string players do, and a sense of harmony that string players often don't have, just because we usually play single notes at a time. Let me say a couple things just about the general idea of getting input from other people. I think my thoughts on this have evolved a little bit since I wrote the blog. I would say if you're in a position of doing this, where you're wanting to do this, choose your sources of input very wisely. Go to the best sources you can, and then trust those people. More isn't necessarily better, because if you think that playing for as many people as possible is better, then sooner or later you're going to get some advice that maybe, not that it directly conflicts, but advice that seems to butt heads with what somebody told you earlier. And so those can be difficult moments for somebody preparing for an audition. And so I would say in general, maybe better to choose more carefully and then trust those people. I would say it can be helpful to choose somebody who's had success at orchestra auditions in the past. Never a bad thing to choose somebody who's been through the process. But it also is, to me, super important to choose somebody who, even if they're not, if they're not a teacher full-time or even sort of officially with a collegiate institution, choose somebody who you get the sense is a good teacher. Because what I mean by that is somebody who's able to give the advice necessary in a way that does not make it seem like it's overly rigid or that things need to be this way or that way. Not everybody's equally good at giving advice, even if they have good advice to give. So do the best you can to find somebody, cellist or non-cellist, whose input you trust musically, maybe who's been through the process, and somebody who you really value how they give input. So all of those things are important. And one other thing about this topic, which is audition comments. If you ask for audition comments, you are liable to get comments. You're probably not liable to know who they came from, and you will not know anything necessarily about the person who's giving you that feedback. So especially here, since we don't discuss, you could ask for comments from two people on me and somebody else on one of my colleagues and get slightly different things, maybe not directly conflicting advice, but audition comments can be a mixed bag because you never know what you're going to get. But remember that you also don't know who's giving you the advice or how they play, for that matter, or whether that person who's giving you the advice plays in a way that you would want to trust them or emulate them. So again, I don't want to say don't get audition comments, but it's probably more important to choose, again, as I said before, trusted sources to give you, real input and guidance as you get ready to play an audition. Okay, last one here, I promise, and then I've been yammering a lot. If an audition ends without anybody being hired, it means the committee thinks that nobody is good enough for them. I won't spend too long on this other than to say that it's not true, or not necessarily true, for sure. In the case of my orchestra, there are a number of contractual conditions that need to be met before somebody can be hired. And that's actually a good thing, in my opinion. The committee has to vote, and you have to get a certain number of votes from the committee, and you have to get the okay of the music director to be hired. And if you have one but not the other, can't be hired. So nobody can overrule anybody else in the process, which also means that it's more difficult to line up the things that need to, or to satisfy all those conditions, shall we say. And it means that occasionally, even though it's tragic to the committee when it happens, that the committee and the music director may not necessarily agree that on who is the best match for the orchestra, or anyway, various things can happen that lead to no decision being made other than the fact that we didn't think anybody was good enough. Oftentimes there is good playing, or plenty of good playing, but beyond that, there has to be a sense that not only was it good playing, but again, that all of the people involved were galvanized enough to be able to say, yes, this is the person, this is the right match for us today. And sometimes it's just not possible for everybody to say that. And so that's a situation often that can lead to a no hire. So take heart when that happens. Nobody is more upset than the committee, who's usually put in hours or dozens of hours at that point wanting to hire somebody good. So it's disappointing when that happens. So that is the end of the list. I didn't try to come up with new myths, but I think maybe we definitely hit several tangents to the 9 that I did come up with, and for sure we can add to this list. I would love it if we could subtract some of the things from this list, meaning that there are fewer things out there that are sort of misinformation that float around out there in the audition wilderness. But I was happy to be able to put these on paper, and I think the blog was fairly popular when it came out. I don't know how often it gets circulated now, but maybe this will give it a new life, or at least give new life and points of discussion to some of these concepts. Good. Let me now try to scroll back and see what we have in the way of comments or questions. And this is going to be good, because I can see it here. First one is somebody from Brazil, and she's asking how to approach the daily studies and different bow speeds in the standard cello repertoire. Okay, this is a broad, you probably can tell this is a broad topic you've touched on. I'm not going to be able to have time to completely do it justice. And I know that earlier this week, Norman Fisher actually did a CelloChat completely on bow speed. So I would very much encourage you to, if you haven't already, to go back and look at that. One of the wonderful things about these chats is they hang around for a while. And I've got quite a number of them now by wonderful colleagues on a whole range of different subjects. So it's great that Cello Bello is doing this. Yeah, I'm trying to even think about how to address the question other than if you are using whatever technical studies you use can be, regardless of how they were intended to be used, they can all be, anytime the bow's on the string, unless it's a pizzicato etude, anytime the bow's on the string, you can make it into a study of the nuances of bow speed. And this is one of those aspects of playing that we can literally drive ourselves crazy in a good way, experimenting with varying bow speed, and with varying, for that matter, the weight and the contact point, the other factors that go into sound production. Why is it a good way to drive ourselves crazy? Well, because experimenting with these things usually involves talking about musical color or sound color, which it's more interesting and feels a lot closer connected to the music we make than playing an exercise just to try to play the bow as evenly as possible, for example, which that's useful as well. But I would say if we're talking about varying the bow speed, we need to know how to use the bow evenly first, then we can start to use it with different speeds. And I tell my own students sometimes that orchestra rehearsals, whether you're in a professional orchestra or a school orchestra, These, if you're good, can be made into practice sessions, and practicing variations in bow weight and speed is one of the things that you can definitely experiment, whether you're playing an etude, sitting in a rehearsal, or playing the repertoire. Okay. Here we go. Next one is, how do you think cellists should choose repertoire for an audition? That's a good question, and some auditions allow you no room to actually choose. If you're talking about an orchestra audition, if you're talking about college audition, for example, you might have actually a wide amount of leeway to choose. Doesn't really matter which one you were referring to, because if you have no choice, then obviously there is no choice, and you're playing what they tell you to play. But if you do have a choice between two things or among three things, I would say, sort of like going back to the instrument myth question, the repertoire that's most impressive is the repertoire that you sound and feel the most comfortable playing. It may be the piece you've known the longest. It might be the piece you have learned the most recently. Could be either one. Sometimes students are loath to feel like they're going backwards in repertoire, going back to something that they learned 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier. But sometimes in reality that turns out to be the best choice, because there's a level of comfort there that is hard to duplicate quickly with newer repertoire. So definitely don't, there should be another myth up here that says you're proving how good you are by what repertoire you play. Definitely a myth. So don't think that you're showing everything just by playing more difficult repertoire. It's actually better to play something that's maybe a little bit less technically difficult, but haven't we noticed, I've noticed anyway, I'm sure you have too, that some of the seemingly simpler pieces in our repertoire show as much or more than the complicated repertoire and very difficult repertoire. So yeah, make your decisions accordingly, but don't hesitate ever to be quote unquote conservative in your choices. Obviously, we don't want to make music conservatively, but the choice can be made from a standpoint of comfort rather than real risk taking. Okay. We're moving down here. Jonathan Simmons, how do you use recording in your practice and with your students? That's a great question. I sometimes tell them to be very targeted, drop in and drop out. What does that mean? It just means that, again, because back in my day, back in olden times, we used to have to come up with this ridiculous setup just to record ourselves. I paid, I don't know how many hundreds of dollars for a Sony Walkman that you put a cassette in, and I had a microphone, and it was you couldn't carry it around with you. Now, we're so lucky to have these devices that, while they're not perfect at capturing sound, it's so easy to record ourselves. But what I've found is not so useful is to record an entire movement of something and then just listen back to it. Why is that not useful? Because inevitably you're going to hear a lot of different things you want to fix, and so it's sort of the opposite of targeted practice. Sometimes you get to the end of the movement and you've heard so many things that don't please your ear that you'd rather go and jump off a bridge than try to address them all. So I'd say choose a very, very targeted reason for recording yourself. It might be, I'm going to play this phrase and try for the best intonation possible. It might be, I'm going to play these 3 lines and listen for my sense of strong rhythm or rubato. It might be not musically related. It might be, I'm going to play the same note with 4 different fingers, and I'm going to try to get my widest vibrato on each finger, and I'm going to try to make all 4 fingers sound the same. So we're talking about recordings that are basically going to be 30 seconds or less. Then it's easy to go back, it's easy to address the issue, and then you can move on, feeling like you've accomplished something, rather than having played through some gargantuan section of music and not really knowing what to do with that afterwards. So that's how I choose to use that. It's also helpful to remember what recordings do capture and what they don't capture. It's great for intonation. They're amazing for rhythm. Tone color, not so much. And dynamic range, not so much, unless you have a microphone that you can that doesn't condense the sound at all. But for a number of basics, sound quality, articulation, intonation, you can get great results from targeted use of recording. It's sort of like the same thing that I recommend for metronome practice. Targeted, drop in, drop out, because ultimately it's more important that we have an inner metronome anyway. But anyway, that wasn't quite the question. Let's move on. There was a question from YouTube Live, it sounds like. What are some of the best schools for becoming an orchestra musician? Aha. I don't know that there are best schools for becoming an orchestra musician, and I say that very much with the intention that it's a good thing. If there were only a few, everybody or a lot of people would be trying to get in, and there wouldn't be enough room for everybody. And so luckily, any city that has an orchestra is liable to have wonderful musicians, and some of them are also going to be very effective and great teachers. Not just the cities that have the most storied orchestral institutions. So many other places around the country. My own story, let me just digress briefly because I think it might be inspiring to some of you, including the place where the question came from, which is when I was finally leaving chamber music full-time and considering taking orchestra auditions, I thought that I would be way behind, quote-unquote behind, people who had gone to schools like the Cleveland Institute, for example, which Stephen Gaber was a legendary long-serving cellist of the Cleveland Orchestra, and he taught at CIM for many, many, many years. I thought I would be behind. What's another example of a school like that? And that's maybe the best example because it's a wonderful school in a city that has a wonderful orchestra. So I thought, there are these people who have been studying with Mr. Gaber for 4 years, orchestra excerpts, and I took orchestra excerpts when I was at Eastman, but Paul Katz won't mind me saying this. He was not an orchestrally focused musician, and I loved that because I wanted to focus on chamber music and I wanted to study with somebody who was focused on chamber music. So we didn't spend maybe any time in our lessons on orchestra excerpts. And so there was a part of me that thought, okay, because I did that rather than the other route, that I would somehow be behind. And I can tell you that it's not true, and in some ways the opposite turned out to be true. So I went to Eastman for my undergraduate. Some of the teachers there were in the Rochester Philharmonic, so there was a duality between orchestral performance and teaching. They had the Cleveland Quartet there, so there was an incredible duality between Eastman and the chamber music program and the Cleveland Quartet. So I don't know if I've actually answered your question or not, but I don't think it's necessary to choose a school that way, because broadening your musical horizons at a great school, any great school, with a great teacher is going to prepare you to do your best work for preparing an orchestra audition, even if you don't go to a school where there's a very rigorous program of orchestral rep studies and things like that. Okay. Do I think it's good to practice orchestral excerpts with piano? Also, how do I maintain stamina and keep from tensing up through an intense passage? Good questions, both of them. I don't see anything wrong with practicing orchestral excerpts with a piano. You could even practice them with another cellist, playing the bass line, or making it into some other, kind of duet. Never a bad thing, because what that usually does is give us a sense of the harmonic changes under the music, which are so important for us to change our sound color. So some people feel like they're great at actually generating that sense of what's going on harmonically without actually hearing it. But of course, it helps a lot to hear it. So if you have the possibility of reading through some of your excerpts with a fine pianist, I would say, yeah, why not take advantage of the opportunity? And the other part of your question was, how do I maintain stamina and keep from tensing up throughout an intense passage? My other teacher, besides Paul Katz, was Janos Starker, and one of Starker's favorite things to repeat that I think came from his colleague, who was a pianist, was create excitement, don't get excited. So we want to differentiate between musical drama and excitement and intensity and physical intensity. And there's a couple things, I guess, to say. One is to remember that and to experiment with the fact that using our body weight and momentum or speed, we can generate incredible power on the cello. We have to practice that, because if you don't practice it, you won't believe that it's true. And you'll probably want to somehow subconsciously insist to yourself that in order to generate intensity at the cello, I have to grip harder or press down harder or grip this way or put 3 fingers down at once, or any of the ways that we can hold on to something. I talk to my students sometimes, a lot actually, about controlling by freedom rather than controlling by holding. And it is possible to learn control by freedom, but we have to practice it, and we have to practice it first alone, then we go onto a stage and we try it then. And we say, hey, this actually works in front of other people. I don't have to, part of, quote, performing isn't doing anything terribly extra from what I practiced. So there's a kind of a connection there that's useful to draw. Sometimes people get themselves into knots because they think that when they perform, they have to turn on some special sauce that ends up making them physically blocked, which obviously is not a good place to be when we perform. One other thing to say about that, which is if an intense passage continues to not go well, whether it's on stage or in the practice room, usually what it needs is not more practice, but a higher level of relaxation in practice and when you execute it. So we have to search for that, and it can be sometimes difficult, especially for younger musicians, to let go of the idea that it's much more about finesse and use of the body, this way, in an ergonomic way, to make a partnership with the cello than holding it and fighting it. All right, moving right along. Kevin, hi Kevin. I've been struggling to find motivation to keep practicing during these difficult days. How do you keep motivation during difficult times? Yes, I didn't start out by mentioning this at all, but yes, who can deny that we're living in times of stress and anxiety and wondering what's in the future. I think in a wonderful sense, music provides all of us with an escape, and I think we all know ourselves well enough to know what types of playing, and in a way what pieces from our past tend to make us feel what's the right word? Just connected again at a time when we all seem very segmented from each other, physically for sure, and musically as well. If we're used to making music from other people, there are technological ways we can still make music with others and be in contact with others, not unlike this chat. But I would say, besides the projects that you're working on in the trenches, like your etudes or your new concerto or whatever, to mix in pieces that take you back to simpler times, more peaceful times in your life and playing career. And also maybe save some time in your practice for what I like to call unstructured practice, which means you don't think about anything in terms of cello technique. You don't think about what recital's coming up or not coming up or whatever. You just play sort of whatever you want. I wouldn't even call it improvisation, because sometimes that puts an added level of stress on it, that somehow it has to be improvisation that somebody else would enjoy listening to, but it doesn't have to be that at all. So those are a couple of actual practical cello suggestions. I would say in a sort of just a psychological sense, let's all remember why we make music in the first place and why we have chosen to continue to make it part of our life, and to realize that we are so lucky to have this. And of course, part of having it means sharing it and communicating with other people, and that's been a little bit dialed back at the time, for the time being, but we still have that sort of gift to share first and foremost with ourselves. So that mindset hopefully can lead to types of activities that will help get us through this. The other thing, if we're Buddhist in our thinking, is to remember that everything always changes. So the current situation, whatever it is, will change. Maybe sooner, maybe later, but there is hope for change. We are a little short on time. I don't know how many other questions. Oh, there's a bunch more questions here. I tell you what, the questions we don't have time to get to, I will do my best to address them. I can just actually address them in these comments, I think, after the fact. But let me take this one from YouTube Live. It says, thank you for doing this. Would you talk a little about rhythmic consistency in audition excerpts, or how you've worked on incorporating it into your technique? Yes, this is a good, maybe last question. I was saying this to a student not terribly long ago, that on the side of the screen that the committee sits on, and I think I know why this is true, and for those of you who've listened to auditions or mock auditions, you probably know this too. Little blips of intonation or tone quality or other imperfections really don't strike the committee in a very jarring way, especially if they're exceptions to the rule. Rhythmic weirdness hits us in a slightly more profound way. Why is that? I think the best, maybe one way to explain it, is that we all play with bad sound momentarily, and we all play a little out of tune momentarily. God knows I do. But not everybody plays with bad rhythm. And intonation and tone quality are very much determined by what's happening from here down, from a physical standpoint on the cello. If we have bad sound or if we play out of tune, normally, obviously, the ear plays a role in that as well. But we can address the issues largely by looking at what's going on in our arms. Rhythm does not come from the arms or the hands or the feet Rhythm comes from somewhere else in the body. I think of it as coming from my gut. My students will tell you it's got to be something that's just right in the very center. And it's independent from the activities in the periphery. And so not everybody plays with bad rhythm, because some people have a great inner clock and are able to trust it, and it's supple when it needs to be, and it's rock solid when it needs to be. And other people, it's not that can't be taught and learned, but other people do have to work harder at developing and trusting that internal clock. But I feel like the first step, I've sort of answered the second part of your question already, the first step in doing that is to remember that it does not come from this stuff. Something I also say to my students occasionally is playing the rhythms and feeling the meter of a piece are two completely different things. And if we think of quote-unquote rhythm as just feeling a pulse and playing the rhythms that are printed on the page in that pulse, then chances are they blur, and it ends up sort of being one thing. It's like, oh, there's this bar and I can never play it with good rhythm. It's just like, and then you count it out and you make sure you understand the rhythm and such. And not that there's anything wrong with that as a practice technique, but it sort of misses the fundamental point that somewhere deep in our body needs to be a metronome that is very, very solid. And whether we're in 2/4 or 3/4, or it doesn't matter, just a pulse, whatever that pulse is, because that gives the arms something to play with and against, and to bend and stay with and all that. So let's not confuse the difference between the ability to feel a very strong meter or pulse and playing rhythms, because rhythms change. Rhythms come and go. If we look at the first page of, whatever, the Dvorak Concerto or Ein Heldenleben or whatever, largely happens in one official pulse, but the rhythms change. And so oftentimes the rhythms are interesting in and of themselves. And so just to make what's on the printed page clear is no small task. And we want the possibility to be able to play with as perfect a pulse as we can. Maybe that's the one way that perfect can be applied in music, which is that it's a skill that's maybe useful when needed to be able to generate a perfectly steady pulse. It's not always necessary, because humans are living, breathing creatures and our hearts don't beat evenly and whatever, but there are times where we need it. And so obviously, anything, just to finish up the question, anything you play can be played with good rhythm or not good rhythm. And you can sort of, in a way, you can be creative and make anything into a rhythmic etude. You can, again, try it. You can put a metronome on, drop in, drop out, check yourself, see what your tendencies are. Knowing our own tendencies, whether it be with intonation or rhythm or anything else, is often a strong first step toward real improvement. So I hope that helps. I see we're out of time, and besides that, it's also happy hour. So thank you all for being here, and let's do our best to get through these challenging times. The cello community has always really banded together in good times and in challenging times, and that is definitely true now as well. So let's all reach out to each other, let's all stay in touch, and kudos to Cello Bello and to Paul and to his staff of folks who work hard behind the scenes to put these chats together. And it's wonderful to have a different one every day, and I look forward to seeing my colleagues later this week in action. All right, take care everybody, see you next time.